A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear members, and thank you for joining us. Here with me, I have the privilege to interview Sister Fida Sanjakdar. Sister Fida is a senior lecturer at the Monash University and is the author of Living West, Facing East, The Deconstruction of Muslim Youth Sexual Identities, and co-editor of Critical Sexuality Education with Professor Andrew Kam-Tuck. We're going to be discussing sexuality education. How are you, Sister Fida?
Alhamdulillah, thank you very much for that introduction and for reaching out and inviting me.
You're welcome. Very short introduction. I have a longer bio on the event post for those who are interested on reading on. We'll get started, inshallah. Okay, so my first question is, can you help us understand the key points of contention when it comes to sexuality education today?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much again for reaching out and for inviting me this evening to this presentation and this live lecture. There are many key points of contention when we're talking about sexuality education in schools today. More recently, particularly with the rollout of the new Respectful Relationships curriculum, perhaps the most dominant key point of contention is the LGBTQI material.
Yeah.
So for those who are not too sure about that acronym, it's the lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, queer, and intersex. And that's now quite a dominant feature of that particular curriculum. And I have to say that I am quite happy that this particular curriculum has evolved where we are including such perspectives, because the LGBTQI community are a significant number, are a part of this community, and for very long, since the inception, if you like, of sexuality education, their viewpoints have been ignored. But now that we've made headways with that particular group, there are other groups that are clearly not present in this particular curriculum, and that's part of my work. I try and talk a little bit more about the importance of including other forms of perspectives to contribute to this whole aspect of diversity. There are other things that remain contentious in this subject area, including do we push for a comprehensive view of sexuality education? Do we maintain an abstinence only until marriage viewpoint? So that's still always open for debate. More recently in the literature, there's been a push for more discussions about pleasure and desire in sexuality education and not just shroud the content with contraception or reproduction. So, or issues of consent and relationships. So they're now quite pivotal, but they remain contentious. You know, how far do we talk about pleasure and desire, and whose pleasure and whose desire? And still quite commonly, the fact that who teaches the curriculum, what is taught, and when is a good time to teach it always remains contentious. So there's quite a few issues, some of which have a historical grounding and some of which are a little bit new, but they all still remain very contentious.
And that's not just limited to independent schools.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely not. Because this particular space is evolving and changing quite frequently, and excuse me, there are so many stakeholders and people that have an interest that they serve the wider community, and the implications for the kinds of programs that are offered are applicable to independent and government or public schools. Absolutely.
Okay, so then what would you tell parents who prefer to have their children exempt from sexuality education?
I think it's important to acknowledge that this is still a point of issue, that there are many parents who are nervous about this particular program when it's delivered to their students. And it goes back to what I said earlier, because they're not too sure about what is being delivered, who is delivering it, and whether the delivery of particular content is relevant at that particular time.
Both within primary years and secondary years, right?
Yeah. Look, absolutely. And I think, though, for parents who are nervous about it or make the decision to remove, I think it's really important that we make it very clear that by teaching no sex education, that is, in fact, you're still teaching sex education. Silence about sexuality education is still teaching them something. Silence is still telling them something. So it's very important that even though parents may choose to remove their children from such subjects, they're not totally removing them from the possibility of still learning about it. So I think it's important, whether they be Muslim or non-Muslim parents, to ask themselves, just because I remove them from such a program doesn't mean that they're not still consumers of Australian media and all of the other avenues where students find their information. And, children and, young adults are inquisitive. They want to know about.
So if they're not finding out this information in a safe environment, then they would be looking for it elsewhere, right?
They would. And I think, we can't be naive to think that our children are not, as I said, they're internet savvy. They are consumers and producers of today's media. So they are very well versed, and, they're inquisitive. But I think for when I address this particularly, to some Muslim parents, I like to just remind them that, this is first and foremost part of their Islamic education as well. And a lot of the teachers that I've worked with in Islamic schools that face the possible resistance from parent groups feel quite confident to be able to say, look, you still have the choice to remove them from this program, but if you chose to send them to an Islamic school and get an Islamic education, this is part and parcel of it. And sometimes when they hear it couched and positioned in that discourse, they kind of feel a little bit more at ease.
Do parents get an insight of the content being taught?
That's a good question, and I think that's probably where we should start with this kind. I think sometimes we rush to think, we've got to deliver this to students, and sometimes it's important to deliver the content, to deliver or some kind of understanding about the purpose of any program to the parents first, answer their questions so that their anxieties are dealt with first, and then bring students in. But I think it's exceptionally important just to frame this entire discourse, this whole discussion around the fact that we are sexual beings, and that this is actually a need. It is not always it's not just a want, and that there are safe and reasonable ways to deal with it, and it's all part of seeking that education.
Okay, thank you for that. How should religious perspectives be integrated into sexuality education in public schools? So we'll start off with public schools first.
Well, religion remains a very contentious topic, particularly in in public schools, because public school advocates will vouch that the reason why we have these schools is to promote a more secular viewpoint. But in my own work, I push really heavily for religious perspectives in sexuality education to be made a little bit more visible in both public and independent schools. And I think it serves two main purposes. One, it acknowledges the fact that there are people, a significant number of people who are religious and who hold religious views dear to their heart, and they use their religious views and understandings as an ideological hook, if you like, to make sense of things. So I think that's the first thing, is to acknowledge that that there are religious people, and that it's a significant aspect to include as part of the curriculum. But I also believe that if by including religious perspectives as part of this curriculum, you're also serving those who are non-religious or even anti-religious, because it just encourages them to develop an understanding, if not an appreciation, but an understanding that there are multiple viewpoints about something. Yeah. And then when you develop an understanding about multiple viewpoints, you're in a better chance of inculcating empathy towards other people. You're a better chance of developing morals and understandings and social cohesion. So I think it's for me, it's two-pronged. As I said, you work with those, you acknowledge and include as part of the curriculum those that are religious, and you include those that are not by allowing them to develop an appreciation for different worldviews. In a public school,
So is it the educator's responsibility to deliver the various perspectives and the various worldviews?
Well, in the public school, it can be certainly delivered by the educators. I'm not too sure about other states and territories. Actually, the research suggests it's rather ad hoc. But you'll find that it's mainly those in health or who have a health or a PE background that become teachers of sexuality education. And look, one simple way for these, that's one way to include the program is through these teachers. Some other schools opt to have private bodies come into the school and deliver, so maybe nurses or people in the sexuality education profession. But in the public school system, one simple way of including religious perspectives is to simply frame it as a theory. See, but when we're talking about this to students, simply just say, look, there are multiple theories and understandings about the issue of consent, for example. And I think, and in my own research, this has proven to be successful, where teachers actually invite the immediate perspectives of students just in the classroom. So if you've got, for example, students from a Lebanese or a Pakistani or a Croatian background, that's your immediate point of inclusion. And so when you frame it in the classroom as these are different perspectives, different ideologies, you're not necessarily promoting it as one way. You're not advocating for it. It doesn't become an indoctrination of a certain viewpoint. It just simply opens up and for a public discussion. So that's one way to do it in public school, quite openly. And in fact, it's one of the ways to deal with controversial issues in general, just to open up and say, here is one theory, here is one idea, and then leave it up for the students. In an Islamic school, the expectations would be a little bit different.
Okay, that was my next question. So, what would it look like in an Islamic school?
Okay. So so Islamic schools serve a specific purpose, and I've written about this before. I mean, not only are they developed to be able to cater specifically for the specific religious and spiritual needs of Muslim students, but they're supposed to be a resource centre for the non-Muslim community as well. Otherwise, Islamic schools actually are no different to any other school in your suburb. So as both people that have resources, including the human resources, this particular subject has the opportunity to absolutely flourish because, of course, in an Islamic school, they've got a better chance of anchoring this kind of understanding in the Quran, in the Hadith, and allowing students to appreciate that, when we're talking about sex and sexuality, it's not dirty, it's not forbidden, it's not haram. I mean, interestingly, I still have students of a Muslim background who come up to me when I'm in the classroom observing effective pedagogies in the teaching of this that say, Miss, why are we talking about this? Isn't it haram? And we should not allowed to be talking about these things. And it's like, it's not haram. If it were, I wouldn't be here. And so I think it's really important that Islamic schools are in a perfect position to break down some of these misconceptions, to demystify this topic area, but also to become a hub to create the resources to demonstrate to the non-Muslim educational community what a religiously inspired sexuality education curriculum can look like. What are some of the resources that can be used? How can we use Quran? Quran is not archaic in this context. The Quran provides for the fruitful components of this subject area. The hadith is plentiful in the resources and evidence of this area. And I think that we have those resources that we can do. And it's actually not an impossible task to achieve, because I worked with a very small community school in Melbourne, and alhamdulillah, we were able to achieve that. We did the grassroots approach to curriculum and pedagogy in this area, and we developed a program and delivered it to their, I think it was year 8, 9 and 10 students at the time. So
how did you find, if you don't mind me asking, the response from the students and the educators?
Oh, amazing, because the educators at first said, we have to do this, there's no question about it. Some of them were like, well, what are we going to tell parents? I had already done a pilot study with the parents. The parents had said, look, we don't really have an issue with this, just as long as we're kept informed, because I'm not confident enough to talk about this topic. So I put it in the responsibilities of the teachers in the Islamic school. So there's still this idea that parents are going to be the greatest obstacle. But even my own research has suggested that it's not really the case. Things just need to be made transparent with them. And also, bring them and have them get involved, in the subject area is very beneficial. And then, so when these teachers created a PLT, professional learning teams, and we had members of the staff from the Islamic department in this team, we had our health professionals, we had our science professionals, and we really worked a grassroots, bottom-up approach to curriculum integration. And where they did kind of, if they did attract a possible confrontation with the parent, they always went back to the Quran and always went back to the Hadith and says, Allah doesn't shy away from talking about these things. And he talks about it with such eloquence. He talks about it with such humility. And that's the way we need to deal with these issues. And that was enough to ease their anxiety, and that's the way that the program was delivered. And I think when teachers and administrators in Islamic schools take on this responsibility with this particular subject area, because it remains contentious, but even with other subject areas, they really do have an opportunity to promote the beauty of the Quran, promote the knowledge that comes through the Hadith, and demonstrate that these are not books that promote fear or misunderstanding or discrimination, because that's the way that's being presented at the moment. But they are books that are full of knowledge and are beneficial. But it's only us that are able to do that kind of thing. That's why my research is always pushing for that religious viewpoint.
Inshallah. Well done. Were there moments where students would bring up questions that perhaps the educators didn't know how to address? And what was that like, if that was the case, through your experience?
Our students in both public, so government and non-government schools, always had questions. I mean, they would mask the typical student behaviour, regardless of whether it was Muslim or non-Muslim. They used humour. They used to deflect their, anxiety, their embarrassment in the subject. But when the teacher created and ensured the students understood it was a safe space, the questions flowed. They wanted to know. Some questions were immediate to themselves. So, is it normal if you don't get a period? Is it normal that, my voice hasn't broken yet? So some of them were directly related to just growing up. And some of them were couched in science, So why do women opt to have IVF if it's naturally possible to conceive? I mean, so when you allow students to voice their concerns or just pose questions in this topic, you will see that it is something that is that is pertinent, that it is on their minds, that it is something that is of relevance to them. They just almost just need to be given the permission, if you like. I love in my own research just interviewing the students. I interviewed a couple of Muslim students in non-Muslim schools, and they made it very clear to me, those particular two students stand out because they were like, I wish the teachers would ask us about our religion and what it says about, sexuality. Because I know a little bit from it. I go to Sunday school and I'm learning from it. I learn from my big sister. But the teacher doesn't seem to be interested. And one student in my research said, I would also like to know how some of my friends make their decisions being non-Muslims. Are they influenced by their religion in that decision making, or is it something else that's influencing them? So you can see that these students are trying to make connections between, where is this notion or understanding coming from? Does it have a religious kind of a rooting, for example, for lack of a better word? Does it have a religious underpinning? And yet it's still an area that's shrouded by a lot of controversy, and I think it will always remain that way.
Okay, final question. What resources would you suggest to educators in public and independent Islamic schools to develop an in-house sex ed curriculum grounded in Islamic perspective?
Wow, I think resource-wise, I think there's always an interest in some kind of tangible resource. So, and when I developed this curriculum at this particular school, we did walk away with like a booklet of resources, reproducible material. But when we're talking about resources, we're not talking about just naming a few of the characters in the story, for example, using
Muhammad or
rather than Emily, we use Ali or whatever. When we're actually trying to be more inclusive of the different perspectives, it goes beyond just naming those characters with those names. When we're looking at resources, we've got to make sure that they are not perpetuating certain stereotypes. They're not instilling certain myths about things. So I think all of the resources that comes to mind for me as an educator, scenario-based resources are great. But be careful with scenario-based resources because you don't want to create scenarios that put students in compromising positions, like a Muslim student who's unwed, barefoot and pregnant. So that might be a little bit inappropriate. So teachers need to have that cultural sensitivity as well. But scenarios are absolutely a great way to cultivate empathy, in students, get them to understand how in the shoes that other people are walking in, get them in an exercise of dialogue, whether it be how do you develop consent in sexual relationships, how do you ensure that you are safe, how do you negotiate your safety, how do you ensure that you are ready for a relationship. So we're talking about those secondary resources, but I think Islamic schools, as I said before, are also perfect hubs to create the human resources that are important. And I think because we've got teachers that have strong Islamic backgrounds, teachers that have strong disciplines in other areas, they are in a perfect position to come together and put something quite unique. So those human resources also, I think.
Would you recommend collaborating with specialists within the community? Like I know in Sydney we now have someone titled the pelvic expert, a young lady who, mashallah, is doing a lot of work for our community. I can imagine bringing someone in and collaborating, working with her and others to create that environment.
Absolutely. I mean, schools are resourceful, and we talk about networking and collaborating with parent groups and community members. And there are many resources out there about women's health, about sexually transmittable diseases or illnesses, about safe sex, about young people. All of those people need to be brought into the schools and to work with the schools on developing something, because our students are not immune to these different facets of understanding. And as inquisitive young adults, they are going to be seeking that information as their bodies change, as they're influenced by their social peers. So the networking is absolutely important, and it's available. It's absolutely available, and there are many. My part of my research into controversy at the moment. I was working with a non-Islamic school about how they were rolling out the new the respectful relationships curriculum. And part of that was talking about porn and the serious problems around watching porn. So they brought in within the department, a small group of people that had put together a resource. And part of that resource were clips of young people in the business talking about, the negative side of it. So again, it's about prefacing this in a way that students understand why it's important for them, and then delivering it to them with an understanding that this is the information you need to know to be able to make those better decisions, because this is an age where they developing agency, they want autonomy in the decisions that they're making. So we need to be working in partnership with them.
Thank you, Sister Fida. It's been a very informative session, mashallah, and I'm sure a lot of us have gained quite a bit from this session. Do you have any final words?
No, I thank you again for the opportunity, and I'm very interested to hear what questions the specific educators might have, whether schools, particularly, say, the Islamic schools in Sydney or elsewhere around our great nation, if you are trying to develop or working with some of the areas that are steeped in controversy, I'd be really interested just to see how you're navigating this space. So please send me an email, make touch, reach out, and I'll be really interested to see just what great work people are doing, because no doubt that people are working in this difficult space, but it shouldn't be something that they do alone. It's very important. No. Yeah, and I think collaboratively we can do very well.
Inshallah. You're getting a lot of thank yous in the comment section. And somebody had posted that the wider Muslim community should embrace this sort of discussion, and children can't be expected to know through osmosis.
Yes, I totally agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exposing a chance for wider understanding. So, mashallah, positive feedback. Thank you so much, Sister Fida.
Thank you again for reaching out and for giving me this opportunity. I hope that the conversations will keep going.
Inshallah. We'll speak soon, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Bye-bye.
Bye.